As opportunities present themselves, we will address priority 2 routes, but not at the expense of priority 1 routes. We did that on the Thursday. We actually left our priority 1 routes, went in and started to do our priority 2 routes. The weather increased, the intensity increased, and we were starting to get calls on our priority 1 routes. We then dropped our priority 2 routes, went back to priority 1. When it started to rain at about 4 o'clock, we went back to our priority 2s. And most of the priority 2s were done by about 8 p.m. on that evening, and we worked through the night to clear the rest. Some of the lessons learned: the crews, the equipment, the materials worked very well. The weather forecasting was very good, I would say even excellent. Pre-salting and brining worked quite well, and any delays in the priority 1 routes due to parked vehicles, our seasonal parking restrictions are not in effect yet, or illegally parked vehicles, or traffic congestion in the rush hour resulted in some delays getting onto our priority 2 and priority 3 routes. Lack of sidewalk clearance by residents is still an issue, although in these 2 events, Mother Nature helped us in terms of clearing it fairly quickly. We have very good communications now with our school district in terms of where they're at, what schools may be closed, where they're clearing their roads. Going forward, our equipment is now all back in the shop. It's being cleaned and serviced and prepared for the next event. Our material stockpile has already been replenished. The seasonal parking restrictions do go into effect this Wednesday, December 1st. And we've also initiated a survey with some primary stakeholders, fire, police, and others, to get some feedback on how we were doing in the first event. And we are looking at a modified priority 2 route being developed for church services on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Basically, when school is closed, we'll redeploy resources from the school routes into these community church sites. Public awareness has been heightened through the recent snow events as well as our winter-wise and other publications, but we'd ask the public to continue to support us by ensuring that the sidewalks in front of their homes are cleared and that snow isn't put onto the road, but rather onto their front lawns, boulevard areas where it won't be pushed back in by plows back onto the sidewalk. We ask residents to help us by not parking on the roadway if at all possible during a snowstorm, and certainly not parking in areas where parking is prohibited. And finally, that residents be prepared with good winter tires and have plans to deal with the winter weather conditions. This is expected to be a very bad winter. They're referring to the worst winter since 1955, worse than the 2008-2009. So I think it's really important that we constantly monitor our effectiveness and be prepared to react and adjust the plan accordingly. That's basically a summary of the presentation of the 2 events, and I welcome any questions.
Councillor Lynch.
Thank you. Got 3 kind of questions. The first one is, and I didn't see on here, but I remember asking this question before. For emergency response, let's say the police have to respond somewhere up around the Western Plateau and the roads are bad. Do they just initiate a call to you and then you send a plow up ahead of them, or same with fire or paramedics, whoever has to be there? How does that work?
It works quite well. We have a utility control center that's manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If the fire, police, or ambulance service require assistance, they contact us through our UCC. Most, if not all, of our trucks now, our snowplow trucks, are equipped with GPS, so we're able to identify which trucks are closest and respond to them. We actually did have one incident in the latest event where a fire truck was stuck. It was after they had been in and dealt with their incident. We responded with our trucks to get them back out so they get back to the fire station and be ready for the next call. So that works quite well here.
Okay, thank you. Priority A and Priority B events, and I don't know if you can answer this question. I'm trying to determine in terms of budget. So a Priority A event for 1 day, 24 hours, how much of our budget would that take as opposed to, say, a Priority B, which is obviously use 4 times as much salt, et cetera, et cetera. So just kind of...
We did run the rough cost through the chair. Yeah. We did run the rough cost for the event on the first event, the minor event. It was about $20,000, material, equipment, and labor. The more recent event this past weekend would be in the $75,000 range. Again, it ran over basically a 36-hour period from midnight through to 4:30 the next day. $75,000. Salt, you saw some of the volumes we were talking about there. 100 tons of salt. A ton of salt is about $100, so that's $10,000 in salt alone on that first incident. $44,000 in salt on the second incident. So the material costs are a very large component of these costs.
Okay, and I heard you talk about the decision to move from a priority 1, when you're taking your routes and you move from priority and you're going into priority 2 and then back to 1. Is that based on complaint basis, or do you have the guys monitoring, or how do you make that decision?
It's almost like a triage event, like you'd have in a medical emergency. We look at our resources, we look at the conditions. We do gauge the number of calls that we're getting both from the priority 1 and priority 2 routes, but it's our crews that are in the field that are making that decision together with the conditions that are there, as well as what's forecasted. So we look at what the forecast is and what the current conditions are on the ground in our own minds, and then make that adjustment, make that call to go to a priority 2 as soon as we can, but not at the expense of priority 1. As soon as we see we're starting to lose it, we'll reposition back to a priority 1.
Right, so if the transit operator said he was on a route and it was particularly bad, then you should reallocate the resources over to that route if necessary.
Yes, even within the priority 1 routes, we'll adjust those slightly. For example, in the morning of the Thursday event, we know rush hour is headed west out of town. So the very first trucks that left the yard all focused on west, and certainly from the yard, Mariner kind of southbound as opposed to northbound. So we do manipulate even within priority 1s to try and focus the target audience on the dominant people. Transit is a very high priority in the plan.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Reamer.
Thanks very much. Yes, I've heard that it's going to be a bad winter, and so you've given us some costs for each event. So my question to you is, how many events are you expecting?
Through the chair, financially for this year, this calendar year, we're in very good shape because of the very mild spring we had last year, or late season winter last year. So the budget concern isn't an issue for this calendar year. We're expecting a number of, I'm going to say a dozen of the kind of the level A events like we had.
Okay.
Half a dozen of the Bs, and unfortunately the Cs, which we typically only see every 2 or 4 years, we expect to see a couple of those as well, right through to late March.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mooney, I have a couple questions for you. And once again, we're working on our residents for sidewalk snow removal, but I've also seen that our businesses aren't getting out and doing their part. I noticed along Brunette from the Petrocan down by the hotel there that their sidewalks in that morning, nobody's out cleaning them at all, and we've had issues along last snowstorm along United Boulevard. Do we send out reminders to the businesses about their responsibilities of keeping the sidewalks along the major routes and keeping it clean in front of their businesses?
Yes, all residences, industrial, commercial businesses, and institutional businesses, institutional property owners all receive the same mailings. We are responding now on a complete basis. Anybody that hasn't cleared their sidewalks within 10 hours of the cessation or the finish of the snowstorm, the sidewalks must be cleared within 10 hours. The first letter is an advisory letter, a warning letter from engineering. It includes a copy of our boulevard maintenance pamphlet that outlines what the requirements are for all property owners in the city. The second complaint for the same property is referred to our bylaws department, and our bylaws department then take action.
Thank you. That's good to know, because it didn't happen on those days. I know, and I'm glad to see you consultation with the bus companies. I do know that there were some issues on that day of the snow. Some routes early in the morning, Laurentian, the bus went sideways down a side street and had to be pulled out just because he was actually ahead of a plow. And I guess we want to make sure that when we're doing those bus routes that we understand the times that they're getting out there, maybe at 5 in the morning and stuff like that, to make sure those are prioritized properly. And that's just a communications issue, I think, between ourselves and that end of it, to make sure we are on the same page. We did receive a couple of letters of complaint from residents in areas, and I talked to you about this earlier, about people that are in steep hill areas, based a couple off of Chilco Drive, that they were parked, they used to park, and there's no parking on Chilco. When it snows, they bring their cars out because they understand that there won't be, like last time when it really snowed heavily for a few days, they dig and plowed for 2 to 3 days. So they understand they're going to have to walk in and out. They were parking on Chilco, but now that we've banned parking on Chilco, and we're protecting, what I understand that we're protecting the bike lanes, which I don't see as a need to protect in a snowfall. these people, especially at the lower end from where Kalamaka is one of the residents, which is a very steep street, about 14%, if they don't park there, they almost would have to park at Coquitlam Center. And so is there any way within a snow event, I know we talked before about we put restrictions on one side, not on the other side, but if we were not to make the bike lanes a priority at all, would that be possible then to give those residents, and there's Tatla, from Riverview, or in those areas, some relief in that area?
Chilco Drive is a priority one route, and at the top end, it's a fairly narrow road, 10 meters wide. If you get two cars parked opposite each other on opposite sides of the street together with snow, it is a transit route. Our plows are quite wide, and one of the challenges when it's snowing is people aren't sure exactly where the curb is. Under normal circumstances, they would see it and they would park within 12 inches of the curb, but we find that they do creep out to the point where it affects our ability to clear the priority one routes. We will still clear them or do the best we can as safely as we can, but it will slow us down. And it will slow us down to get to the priority two routes, which are the Kalamalkas, the Nadinias, the Douglas Crescents. And our hope would be that we, at the lower end of Chilco, I should say, that there is some on-street parking. We've banned it on one side seasonally, but on the other side where there is no bike lane, we have continued and will continue to provide on-street parking there on Chilco because it's wide enough. We can allow the parking to coexist with snow plowing. At the top end, it's our opinion, and we've looked at it quite closely, is that any parking up there will adversely affect our abilities to clear it quickly, safely, and effectively. Having said that, if we can clear those priority one routes quickly, it allows us to get into those priority two routes, of which Kalamalka is one, Nadinia and Douglas as well, and allow those priority two routes to be cleared in a timely fashion as well. Unfortunately, vehicles abandoned on the road in no parking zones really do affect our ability to do it quickly and safely, and in a major event where we have emergency vehicle access concerns and so on, we'll actually come to the point where we have to tow those vehicles. So I think, again, it's one of those things where the residents need to prepare their vehicle and need to make some plans, perhaps to park a distance away. We will be into those priority two roads as quickly as possible, and in that latest event, I think it was around 8 o'clock on the Thursday night, we were in to Kalamalka and cleared it, and at that point, people can move their vehicles into their property and preferably right into their driveway so that we can keep those secondary roads clear as well.
Because it's just I know at the lower end there's some parking on Chilco at the lower end, but then it goes no parking again where the road width seems to be the same again. And I looked at that saying, well, if we could allow on one side a seasonal snow event parking on the lower end of Chilco up there. I do know, I know your concerns about the narrowness of Chilco at the upper end there, and I don't know if you could put in one side parking or not. It may not be feasible because I do know at the last major snow event we had up here, we had problems at the top end of Chilco where it became, I don't know if you're aware of this, it became virtually one lane at that time. So I understand those questions, but this is just not one. There's a bunch of areas like this. Those people in those areas are pretty much for a day or something are not going to work or can't get out of their places. The other question somebody raised to me is that, okay, on Chilco, houses, their backyards back onto Chilco, are they responsible for the sidewalk there, or are they only responsible for the sidewalk in front of their house?
In terms of the second question, I think the first one was more of a statement than a question, in my interpretation anyway. The second question, or second part, yes, they are responsible for all sidewalks that abut your home. So whether it's this corner lot, you might have the front and the side yard, or in the case of those double lots that are on Mariner and Chilco, they're responsible for sidewalks on all sides of their property.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Any other questions? Councillor Lynch.
Well, that was a no.
Oh,
I've already spoken.
I thought you raised your hand. You wanted to speak. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Do we have a mover on this information for receipt?
It's just a verbal update. There's no report to actually receive, so I think we can move on to the next item.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have minutes of the Disability Issues Advisory Committee meeting held Tuesday, November 9th, and recommendation to receive those minutes.
Receipt.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? Opposed? Carried.
The committee has a recommendation. They would like that council change the name of the committee from the Disability Issues Advisory Committee to Universal Accessibility Advisory Committee.
Okay, is anybody here to involve in that committee to speak to this at all?
Councillor Robinson is not here. On first blush, I don't see a problem with it. We'd have to take it forward to council, but it sounds like the name is just reflecting the new way of looking at people who have these challenges.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Councillor Reamer?
Well, I understand that this is a request that comes from the committee, and so from that perspective, I don't have a problem with it. But when I'm trying to think of people understanding what the committee is all about, whether, quote, Universal Access Committee will have as much meaning as a Disability Issues Advisory Committee will, I'm a little unclear on. So that's that would be my only concern. And they may have possibly already discussed that. I don't know.
Well, I see no, I think it would probably be Mr. Suzak, please.
Sure. Mr. Chair, some of our staff attend those meetings, and they may have a perspective also on why the name change and what might be behind it.
Thank you.
Mr. Maharok.
Through Dan Mooney and I are both resources at that committee meeting, and there was quite a discussion around the emphasis on having a name that was seen as a positive element versus a negative. So it was felt that disabilities was seen as exclusive, and accessibility was seen as an inclusive, proactive type of name. And there was much discussion around it, and so this is the name that they came up with. The universal aspect really speaks to best practices. So universal access is a term that is coined from best practices literature, and you'll hear more about that as we move into the future and some of the recommendations for design guidelines. It actually came up as part of the Austin Heights Neighborhood Plan at Land Use Committee around the idea of accessible universal access principles. So I just wanted to shed some light that there was quite a bit of discussion in that regard.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. So we will move that on to council. So, second?
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's the last formal item on this agenda.
Motion to adjourn.
All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you, everyone.